Welcome to GovExperts Insights, where we talk about politics, policy, and the practice of both. We're here with Jim Lechner, a retired lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Army regular, and with a new book entitled "With My Shield." Jim, welcome to the podcast, and excited to have you here. Looking forward to our conversation.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Before we talk about your book, I want to set the scene for the audience with a little bit about your background. Can you tell us about your military experience and kind of what moved you into the Army?
Sure. I enlisted in the National Guard, the Army National Guard, out of high school. I was a junior in high school when I first went to basic training in the infantry school. Then I went to a military college, the Citadel in South Carolina, and was commissioned as a regular Army officer. I was initially commissioned in the field artillery, and then later on changed back to the infantry. That's relatively important early in my career, but again, served in the Army for about 22 years as an officer. I got to participate in a number of different operational deployments, to include going to Somalia. I went on a peacekeeping mission in the Sinai between Egypt and Israel and the Palestinians. I participated in operations in Bosnia, and then multiple tours in Iraq, and then about almost 10 years in Afghanistan. And then I retired in 2011 and became a contractor. I continued on in Afghanistan until the war in Ukraine started, and I've been in Ukraine for most of the last 2 years.
You studied history in college. Did you always kind of know that, obviously with the Citadel and the history experience, I mean, this is kind of a natural career path for you, but what an interesting life you've had.
Yeah, it really has been. And yeah, certainly history has always been my focus. I wasn't a great student in college, but I really was focused on my history courses and somewhat on English. But and then getting out of, when I graduated from the Citadel with a degree in history, I went on and got a master's in history, and I teach military history and American history at Liberty University currently in their online school.
Interesting. So let's talk a little bit. You mentioned the Ukrainian war, and you've covered it. You've been monitoring it. Kind of what's your assessment of where things stand right now in Ukraine?
Yeah, and just to kind of amplify, some background on this, I initially went over to Ukraine just about 2 weeks after the invasion began as a correspondent from Newsmax. There was a Newsmax team inside Kyiv, which at that time was surrounded on three sides by the Russian army and under siege. I went into Kyiv, joined that team, and then I became a correspondent myself for like the next 6 months working for Newsmax, because that worked out pretty well. Then I moved into a training role with a company that was doing some training over there, and then began to serve as a volunteer with Ukrainian military forces, doing advise and assist, and actively trying to support them as best I can. So that's kind of given me some perspective. Both the journalist piece gave me some really good access to include to the presidential administration, but then also going to almost every major battlefield in the Ukraine war currently, if not during the fighting, but immediately after. So I've gotten a pretty good perspective on what's going on, and I bring to the table my professional military background and my military history background to provide my assessment. So where I think the war is at now is, for the last 6 months at least, it's been a stalemate. We like to refer to it as World War I with drones. There's a number of reasons for that. The front, I think a lot of Americans don't realize, the front is over 200 miles long, from north of Kharkiv all the way down to just south of Kherson. So it's a long front. It's been static now for at least the last 6 to 9 months, meaning that neither the Ukrainians nor the Russians can make any large advances. And really similar to World War I, they're measuring the success or their immediate objectives in the fighting are matters of hundreds of meters that they're fighting for. And there's huge amount of resources and blood and treasure and equipment being poured into that just to achieve, a couple of 100 meters in an attack. And so that's why, really tragically and horribly, I think it harkens back to World War I. But it's also important to note that there's modern technology to include drones there. So again, to answer your question, the front is primarily static. A couple of the biggest events that have occurred in the last 6 months is the Russians expended hundreds of thousands of troops to capture the city of Bakhmut out in the east. And then just about 2 weeks ago, they captured another small city called Advivka. And again, both of those cities were relatively under siege for 9 to 10 months, almost a year. And it took the Russians a significant amount of investment in troops and lives and focus to capture those cities. But again, not large amounts of movement going back and forth between the Ukrainians and the Russians. And so they're both in static trench lines and just kind of slugging it out for a couple of 100 meters at this point.
Do you think the use of that drone technology has, it's obviously amplified the loss of life and probably extended the conflict on both sides? It's just with how much more efficient they can be in the battlefield. Is that what's been your experience about the drone technology and on both sides of how it's affecting the conflict there?
Yeah, the drones, the utilization of drones at multiple levels, and I mean like the tactical level at the individual fighting, and then at the strategic level, such as the air campaign, that really can't be overemphasized enough. Starting at the strategic level, the Russians have relied mainly on cruise missiles and on drones to attack Ukrainian cities. And this has proven a very difficult challenge for the Ukrainian air defense, which at this time with Patriot missiles and other things is largely based on NATO systems. So they've had a hard time dealing with the drones. We've known this from a technological perspective that slow moving, cheap drones out of cheap material like plastic and wood and things like that are going to be really difficult for our modern air defense systems to intercept, which is ironic, but it's true. And the Iranian Shaheeds and now the Russian copies are very effective at penetrating the air defense systems. Now, there hasn't been a huge amount of damage. I mean, that's not going to take Ukraine out of the war, but it's significant pressure on the economic system and on the civilian population. Down to the tactical level, it's interesting. There's been a difference between how we've employed drones in the last 20, 25 years and how they're being employed now. If you remember from the war on terrorism, we would mainly employ fixed wing drones that could fly for long periods of time and then conduct reconnaissance and do intelligence work for us. That's not necessarily what's going on the front there in Ukraine. Down at the tactical level, the soldiers on both sides are mainly utilizing these small quadcopters like DJI Phantoms or something like that, a small handheld drone that they can put up for about 20 to 30 minutes, and that'll find their adversaries directly across from them, the trenches, or it'll find artillery pieces, or it'll find tanks. And then to varying degrees, they're able to launch drones that are now armed, not like our drones that'll launch missiles, but drones that'll carry some explosive ordnance or carry a grenade or carry something like that and go attack that target. So, literally at the most basic level, you're sending these small quadcopters over to the trench across from you, and you're finding your adversary, and then you're dropping a grenade on them, or you're actually kamikazing that drone down into your adversary. And they're doing that with tanks as well. And this has been a huge, huge challenge for both sides. And I can talk more about that if you're interested. But again, it's a daily force multiplier, a daily impact on the battlefield. And I'll just give you a quick metric. The average Ukrainian drone platoon that I was working with would lose about 25 to 30 of those drones a month, because you send them across and they either get shot down or the electronic warfare systems will bring them down. So for whatever reason, you'll lose 25 to 30 a month. And that's just from one platoon. And again, the Russians have the same capability or greater than the Ukrainians do in this capacity.
Yeah, I do find that interesting. I find it interesting too, just the lessons that are going to be taken out of this for other conflicts and other areas of the world that we'll talk about later. Based upon kind of what you're seeing over there, I mean, what does victory look like in Ukraine?
Well, I don't think there's a lot of good news here. The Zelensky administration and the nation, it's a national effort on the Ukrainian side, have said they want to liberate, every square foot of Ukrainian territory, and that includes Crimea. That includes all the Donbass, obviously. I really don't see how that's going to be possible in the current state of affairs for a number of reasons. And so this is a dilemma that politically Ukraine is going to have to deal with. What is the end state going to look like? And I don't see militarily how Ukraine's going to be able to really push Russia back much farther than they have. We can talk more about it later, but unfortunately, I see the Russian capability and strength growing. And so any window of opportunity Ukraine had to do that, to push the Russian lines back and liberate territory, I think at this point for now has passed. And so I think what Ukraine is going to have to do, and this is pure conjecture on my part, since they don't have a military option to liberate their territory, I think negotiations are going to have to be the best case that they can make them. The good news is I don't think right now Russia is going to be able to make significant more gains. They're not going to take major cities like Kharkiv or Dnipro, or certainly not Kyiv at this point. They can probably make some advances, and we can talk some more about that, the growing Russian capability. But I think what the Ukrainians have to do is get some of the best advantages they can. There's economic issues at play, not just territory. And so, in order to keep things like Crimea, to keep things like the Dnieper River access, which is very similar to the Mississippi River access to the Black Sea, in order to keep those things open and viable, the Ukrainians are going to have to make some major concessions in territory, and I just don't see any other option for them.
If you look at it from the Russian standpoint, obviously when the war wasn't going well, you had the incursion back, and civil unrest there within Russia. It sounds like they've got their economy focused in on the war now. They're lining up behind their military. They're fighting at least to a stalemate. Things. Does that mean that Putin is in a stronger position internally?
Yeah, my own personal observations and assessment, and they're playing out to be true, are that we've completely, or in many ways, misread the Russian effort here. The Russians, as stated by President Putin, their aim is to bring all Russian-speaking peoples under their influence. And if you look at the map of what they've done in this war, they've achieved that. They've gotten the Donbass under their control, 90% of it. They've gotten about 90% of their objectives in regards to the Ukrainian coast. Only Odessa is still in Ukrainian hands to a degree. Kherson is in Ukrainian hands, but the Russians are just on the other side of the river, so they effectively control or influence that. So what the reality is the Russians have militarily achieved the majority of what they wanted to achieve, get those areas under their control. Now, again, if you look at their war aims, I see it as really a nice to have. What they wanted to do was take down the Zelensky government and do this denazification, and they tried to take Kyiv and do that and put a more pro-Russian government in. And I think everybody focused on that, on the disastrous effort to do that. But really, in the big picture, their strategic goal was to control the Donbass and control as much of the southern coast as they could, and they've achieved that. Again, like I said, the Russian invasion tried to take out Kyiv in addition to all those other objectives, and that failed miserably. We all saw that, but that's really not the key piece of what they were trying to do in the invasion. And I think, again, if you look at the map, they have achieved what they wanted to achieve.
So you think they have enough to claim a measure of victory in and of themselves?
I think if peace went with the current set of conditions on the ground today, they certainly have achieved a military victory. A couple of things that we've misread on the Russian effort is we've taken a Western view or a 21st century view to casualties. And even I was shocked by the fact that the Russians don't have the same perspective. Losing tens of thousands of troops to achieve that strategic objective for the nation is not as big an issue to them. And they're willing to feed hundreds of thousands of troops into the line to achieve those objectives. The other thing that I think was completely misread was that, while they did make mistakes, and they were pretty fantastic mistakes on trying to take Kyiv and being significantly defeated there, all their other objectives were met, and they did methodically move forward economically and militarily as far as their mobilization. So I think Russia's been on a war footing since day one. Their economy, all their military efforts, they're dealing with their allies. As you remember, he went to China just before the invasion and set the conditions for this. And all those things have absolutely played out. We're seeing Chinese spare parts in the missile systems We're finding, foreign fighters coming in to help them. The Russian economy is significantly producing military equipment now. I just saw a report that the Russian economy is set to produce over 1 million of those drones that I talked about over the next year. And so, again, in the West, in the U.S. specifically, we're just now getting into gear on what we should do and increasing our military production to support this war. Russia's been in that gear since day one, and there's no sign, like these pundits on TV will tell you, there's no sign of that slowing down or weakening, or their economic or social position weakening. So I think we've misread the Russians' approach to this based on just a couple fantastic failures, such as Kyiv.
So you mentioned the West kind of getting in gear. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on the funding in Congress and the fight over military funding for Ukraine.
Yeah, it's one of my biggest disappointments coming back here, and I certainly we were having some discussions. I certainly am not a supporter of this administration, but I think to convolute, assisting a democracy fight off the Red Army and the new Marxism, to convolute those two things, your opposition to this administration together, is really going to be a stain on the Republican Party and conservatives for a long time. We're completely, again, misreading this. The Republicans and the conservatives that are against supporting Ukraine, I think, are falling prey to Russian propaganda in many cases. I know that's the case. And again, while I completely support the hardest line positions on the border, to tie those things together or compare those things to Ukraine aid is like apples and a rock. It doesn't make any sense. So that's been one of my biggest disappointments. And I think the aid that we need to provide to Ukraine, need to continue to provide, is absolutely critical. And then on the other side of that, I think the Biden administration has shown the same level of incompetence and inefficiency that it showed in the Afghan withdrawal. That level of incompetence has been the same thing we've applied to the war in Ukraine. And I could go into, in great detail on how inefficient and negligent and incompetent our assistance to Ukraine has been. We've sent our old weapon systems and our old ammunition stocks, 30, 40-year-old ammunition, over to Ukraine. We've absolutely trickled in the weapon systems that they say they need. We've not done the things that really need to be done as far as advising and assisting the Ukrainians. I mean, there's been a ridiculous level of restriction on the U.S. military assisting the Ukrainians, having to try to do that from Poland, or worse yet, from Germany. I mean, how do you manage and advise a war from Germany? And I could just go on in great detail. We've had the Army National Guard, which I was previously a member, be the ones that are primarily training the Ukrainians. That's absolutely a mismatch in skill and capability, and it just shows the incompetence of this administration in assisting the Ukrainians.
So if you're comparing our response to Ukraine in 2023 and 24 to the Reagan administration and Afghanistan in the late 80s, things obviously, both were proxy wars with Russia or the Soviet Union at that point. But very different approaches, and with also, and we'll talk about this as we go along here, great impacts on the world outside of those things, lessons learned, seeds planted, things. But talk a little bit about the comparison between the two.
Sure, it's there are some points you can compare. Obviously, the Afghans were an insurgency against the Russians, but we identified what the most critical needs were, i.e., air defense. And we provided Stinger missile systems. We took risks with that by providing them high technology. But more important, we allowed U.S. government forces to get in on the ground and make sure these things were able to be trained and effectively employed. And we did those things. And there is a good comparison that the Afghan Mujahideen fighters were going to fight. They were going to stay on the ground, and they were going to fight no matter what. And the Ukrainians are the same way. They are excellent soldiers. They absolutely back up everything they say as being able to fight, but it's just about capability, both with weapon systems and operational level capability. And you cannot develop operational level capability against an army the size of the Russian army. The Ukrainians are outnumbered 5-1, and you're just not going to be able to defeat a Soviet-style army using those tactics, using the same tactics. It's mass, and the Ukrainians just can't do it. But they have the bravery. They definitely have the skill at the individual level to do that, to stand in line to fight, just like the Afghans did. And so we need to be able to commit, and we need to be able to ensure they have the capability and the weapon systems they need. And it's not just about, in the case of the Ukrainians, it's not just about providing high-tech weapons. I often tell the Ukrainians, they lament the fact they don't have M1 tanks or F-16s, and those would certainly be good weapon systems, but they could do what they need to do with older weapon systems. It's all about capability. They need to develop a Western NATO-style capability, such as combined arms, to defeat the Russians. You can't go Soviet tactics against Soviet tactics when you're outnumbered 5-1 and think that you're going to win. But I temper that by saying the Ukrainian army certainly has shown incredible valor and bravery on the battlefield and willingness to stand in the line and fight. They just need the proper training and they need the proper equipment to do that. And we've been unwilling to even give them a fraction of that. Again, we're trying to manage the war from Germany, and we're not using the right people to do it.
And of the European countries and NATO, which of them are stepping up? Are any of them stepping into this role to provide kind of that strategic assistance to Ukraine, or are they kind of in the same vein as what the United States is in?
The people or the nations that are providing the most direct support, no surprise, are the ones that have the Russians on their doorstep. So the Baltic countries are very involved. Poland is very involved. Poland has borne a significant weight in this war because they have over 1 million Ukrainian refugees living in Poland now. I think maybe we can kind of sympathize with that to some degree in our own border situation, but they've borne that, and they've provided great support. They've set aside their past differences with Ukrainians and provided great support. So the Baltic states and Poland have stepped up and are doing a good amount of effort. But again, it's a U.S.-led policy within NATO that we're not going to allow NATO troops to get on the ground in the fear of escalating the situation. And while there are some valid concerns, I mean, obviously you don't want NATO combat units going into the country and engaging the Russians. That would obviously be an unwise escalation to this conflict. However, there are things that can be done, and to try to manage the war with civilian government personnel from Germany is absolute negligence, and that's how the U.S. is approaching it. And in many ways, that's how we're restricting our allies through NATO policy from doing that. The Ukrainians don't need people to fight on the ground. Even the Western volunteers that I'm a part of, we can talk about that more later. They don't really need us on the ground to fight. What they need is advanced capability and then being able to employ some of this technology and weapon systems. And you just can't do that from Germany or back in the US pontificating to the Ukrainians. You have to be on the ground. You have to be advising and assisting. While that doesn't mean you need to be clearing trenches, you have to be there with your counterpart to make sure things are being done correctly.
So we talk about that and the European involvement and NATO. What do you see as the future of NATO and the U.S.-European alliance?
Well, I do think that's one of the positive things to come out of this. If there can be a silver lining, is the NATO alliance, at least on the eastern portion of that, has woken up to the reestablished Russian threat and the Russians' ability and willingness to use military force. And again, our previous comments, they're going to gain a military victory out of this. And so I think that is a defeat as much for NATO as it is for the Ukrainians. That Russia has been allowed to militarily achieve objectives, even limited ones. And so the silver lining is allies such as Poland, the Baltic states, Romania, Hungary, they're putting significant effort and resources and focus into rearming and being prepared to meet the Russian threat. And I'll also say, based on my observations of the Russians, I'm not significantly concerned about Western Europe. We're not going to see the Russians advancing through Ukraine into Poland. The NATO capability at this point today remains strong enough that I don't think the Russians pose a serious threat to us. However, their willingness to use military force does pose a threat to the Baltics. It does pose a threat military to Poland. And so the silver lining is our allies, I think, are going to put a significant effort and resources towards rearming and sustaining and increasing capability.
If you were looking forward 10 years from now and kind of prognosticating a crystal ball, where do you see things shaping out?
Like 10 years forward in Ukraine or in Eastern Europe?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think Russia's going to come out of this okay. Again, the biggest thing that they've taken is they'll probably lose by the end of this. They'll lose over 100,000 troops killed. I think very rough guess they've lost somewhere between 55 and 75,000 troops killed. Again, they'll build some monuments to that, but culturally, this doesn't affect them. They're going to be fine militarily. They're learning an incredible amount of lessons in this. They're improving their capability monthly. They're gaining strength. They're gaining skill. They're validating and revalidating and improving their weapon systems. So I think their military and their overall strategic posture is going to be fine from this, and they will have achieved geographic objectives and they've strengthened their alliance with countries like China, North Korea, and certainly Iran, who again are no friends of ours, who we're actually engaged in war with. And as you can take this, discussion by extension, you've seen capability in organizations like Hamas via the Iranians increase based on lessons learned from Ukraine. So I think the Russians are going to be fine with this. I do think, I'm not defending things that President Putin says. I do think there is some sincerity, and I think there's some truth to what he's saying about being able to establish a buffer to NATO. And so this is militarily going to allow them to do that. I don't think Ukraine is going to come into the NATO sphere. But again, I think you're going to see a resurgence in military capability and rearmament in Eastern Europe, principally among countries like Hungary, Romania, and Poland, and the Baltic states. And so I think those things will balance each other out.
Very interesting. And if we look beyond, Europe and the war in Ukraine, but what are our adversaries? What does China take away from this, and what does it mean for the United States around the world, and particularly, for Taiwan?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's unfortunately from a American citizen or a U.S. government perspective that bothers me the most about this conflict is the Chinese have been watching this since day one. They've gauged our response. You can look back through history. Our adversaries certainly watch what our responses are to crises, and then they plan and act accordingly. And I think this has been a significant damage to our prestige and damage to our ability to stand against other adversaries worldwide, both the Iranians and the Chinese. I think there's a lot of truth to what's said. I don't think we're ever going to stop groups like Hamas from attacking Israel. That's far too outlandish a goal or unachievable a goal. But the capabilities that they brought to the table via the Iranians, that was certainly strengthened by our demonstrated weakness, by not only lessons they learned, but our demonstrated weakness. And the Chinese are certainly looking at this. And I think I'm not a China expert. I'm not a Pacific expert. But if you read the tea leaves and watch China and what they're doing, they've been pushing the U.S. That's just their policy. They're going to push us in every sphere or in every line of operation. They're going to push us to include militarily. And that's just been increasing over the last couple of years. And I think it's in major part due to not only the ineptitude we showed in pulling out of Afghanistan, but in our response, our very diluted response to Russia and Ukraine. I think it's emboldened the Chinese without a doubt.
It's quite interesting times that we live in, and I do want to talk about the book and With My Shield that you've written, and one of the things that in just kind of thinking and what I've read so far in regards to it is the place of the Mogadishu battle within this kind of long line of history and the battle between the West and its adversaries and things that we're still learning about Somalia, things the involvement of Al Qaeda there and others that many years after the fact kind of became apparent, but you were on the front lines of it. But I do want to talk about the book, and I was hoping you might give a little bit of context. I think this is make sure it gets on camera here. But With My Shield by Jim Lechner. The story of an Army Ranger in Somalia. Can you give a little bit of context about what led up to the conflict there, and then we'll talk specifically about kind of the events of the book and your experience.
Sure. Again, as I mentioned, I've been in a number of wars and conflicts, 6 wars and conflicts, and this was the first war that I was involved in I was a lieutenant in 3rd Ranger Battalion about 30 years ago. I arrived in the battalion just as Desert Storm was kicking off for a variety of reasons, one of which the war went so fast, was over so fast. The Ranger Battalion that I was in was not involved in it, but then I stayed there for the next 3 years. We were training like we were going to the Super Bowl. And then on my last, literally like my last few weeks in the battalion, one of the 3 companies that are assigned to the battalion was tasked to join Task Force Ranger, a special operations task force being sent to Somalia. It was not my company that was chosen, but the lieutenant who did my job in that company, in B Company, went on emergency leave just hours before we got the orders. And so I was pulled from Alpha Company into Bravo Company at the very last minute on my very last weeks in the battalion to join Task Force Ranger. In the early 90s, the government of Somalia had fallen. It was a Soviet proxy state. They had all the weapon systems, ammunition, machine guns, MiG-21s, tanks. They had all the weapon systems that a Soviet proxy state in the Horn of Africa would normally get. When that government fell, the various ethnic tribes took all that equipment and they armed these large militias, and then they divided principally the city of Mogadishu, which is about 1 million people, into ethnic ghettos of a couple of 100,000 people each. There's probably 5 major tribes there. One of these tribes, all of the tribes, when a famine occurred, all of these tribes used their power to control food relief efforts by the UN. And so the UN finally mounted an invasion, military invasion, to secure the city of Mogadishu and ensure these food relief efforts would get to the refugees. And that went fairly well. When President Clinton took over from President Bush, he decided to try to do nation building in Somalia and reestablish the government. And that's when one of the major tribes, the Haber-Gidder, decided to start conducting an insurgency against the UN and take ultimate power there. And that's when Task Force Ranger was called in. At the time, the thought was that you could take out the leader, capture the leader of the Somali National Alliance, a former Somali general. And if we did that, the resistance would collapse. We were pessimistic about that, but we were very young. We were very anxious to get into the fight. We were very honored and proud to be part of Task Force Ranger. And so we obeyed orders. And we knew that really wasn't going to be effective. But we did a number of operations through the months of August and September of 1993, trying to capture General Adid. It was very difficult based on the conditions of where he was at, secured by his tribe in this huge city. And finally, we expanded the targets to his lieutenants and began to take apart his leadership. And until one day, there was a large meeting going on right in one of the strongholds of the Haber-Gidder area in the middle of the city, and we launched a raid there. And in the course of that raid, kind of harkening back to your previous question about our adversaries watching us, in the middle of that raid, some Al-Qaeda advisors who had been training some of the Somalis helped them shoot down one of our Black Hawk helicopters, and then that resulted in the longest and most intense firefight it's been called since the Vietnam War.
Yeah, and a fascinating lead up to that. So then you find yourself in an 18-hour battle for survival, for rescue of that of the crew there, and to make it out. At the time that you were there, who did you think you were fighting?
Well, it was very clear to us that the entire Haber-Gidder clan or tribe in Mogadishu was our adversary. They, again, not much of a national identity, an absolute clan or tribal identity. They lived in an absolute ethnic ghetto, somewhere between 400,000 and 600,000 people in a densely packed urban environment. One of the interesting things that we could observe in Mogadishu was the other 4 ethnic clans in their other 4 neighborhoods were very pro-UN. They would wave at us as we flew by in our helicopters. But as soon as we crossed a street or an area into the ethnic area of the Haber-Gidder, that's when we started receiving ground fire. So it was clearly we were fighting this clan. But again, as we mentioned, this was a classic commando style operation. We were doing a fast strike raid to land helicopters right in the building where the meeting was taking place and then extract within an hour. There was less than 150 Army Rangers and Army Special Operators on the ground conducting that raid. And we relied completely on speed. And we were right in the middle of the stronghold of this neighborhood. And there was literally, people often question this figure, but there was literally tens of thousands of Somali fighters converging and engaging us on that operation. And when we lost that first helicopter and had to secure that crash site, then we were in for a fight because we weren't going to leave. And those incredible odds were arrayed against us.
Now, up until the time that the helicopter went down, had the extraction been successful?
Oh yeah, 100%. We were right on track. In fact, again, we had a template that if we could stay on the ground for less than an hour, the Somalis, for a variety of reasons, weren't able to react faster than an hour. They weren't able to collect their forces and get to the area to fight. And so we could deal with the local resistance that we would run across, people that happened to be there or security forces that were there. We could deal with them, but the crowds of thousands to tens of thousands of fighters were unable to converge in less than an hour. And so we were going to be in and out in an hour. At about 45 to 50 minutes, we would obviously watch the clock very closely. And at about 45 to 50 minutes, we were actually getting in on our trucks, which had driven out to meet us. We were getting on our trucks and loading up to leave the area at about 45 to 50 minutes when this helicopter was shot down.
So the helicopter goes down, and you were there with the trucks at that point. And things. I'm trying to your role in the operation. Where were you?
Yeah, again, I was part of what we called the assault force, and so Rangers and special operators would fly in helicopters to whatever the building or location in the city was, and then we would use a method called fast roping. The helicopters couldn't land in that dense packed city for the most part. And so we would kick a rope out the side of the helicopter and then slide down it like a fire pole, which was incredibly dangerous because we weren't attached to these ropes. And at some points we were up to 90 feet up in the air sliding down. And so we would assault the objective doing that, go into the building, put a security perimeter around the building is the primarily job of the Rangers, while the special operators went inside. And then we would hold that target until we secured all the prisoners we wanted to get. And then a convoy of our own trucks would drive out from our base at the airport, would drive out through the neighborhoods and then meet us. And we would jump on these trucks and then drive out of the neighborhood. And that's what was occurring on this mission. And again, we were getting on the trucks. We were getting ready to leave the area. We were collapsing the perimeter of Rangers, and the special operators were getting together and loading the prisoners on the convoy as the helicopter went down. And when that happened, again, we had some of our comrades were alive at the site. We were unable to extract some of the two pilots who were killed from the wreckage. And so we made the decision that we were going to stand and fight around that crash site until we could get everybody out.
And so you realize then that you've got a long fight ahead of you. And what were the steps that you took immediately after, when you making the decision to stay and fight? What was that decision like? And then what were the steps that you took from that?
Well, this is one of the big lessons that I learned that I was able to carry into my future wars and combat operations is, again, I was just a lieutenant. I was taking orders, but we were aware of what the big picture plan was. And the big picture plan was that UN forces, principally a U.S. light infantry battalion, was there as a reaction force, and they would come out and support us. I mean, we knew that taking 150 guys into this stronghold was a very difficult proposition. And if we had to get in a big fight, it was going to be incredible odds. That was never our plan. The plan was that the United Nations forces would send a relief force or a reaction force out to meet with us, to get alongside of us, to assist us, bring some more firepower, bring some more transportation, and then we would together extract the force. So it was never the plan for just 100 or so of us to be standing and fighting around that crash site. But for various reasons, that did not take place. Throughout the night, throughout the afternoon, late afternoon and the evening and the nighttime into the early morning hours, the United Nations tried to get its forces together. They were able to get Pakistani tanks. They were able to get Malaysian armored cars and bring this hodgepodge coalition force together and then orient it towards where we were fighting and then come out and finally link up with us in the morning and able to get on those vehicles and get our wounded and our dead and everybody that was left out of the site. But again, that took all night. And in the meantime, we had less than 100 guys on the ground, increasing number of wounded. We had to move about 4 blocks, fight our way about 4 blocks from the target building to the crash site through increasing amount of Somali resistance. And what I personally did in that action was my job was to talk to the helicopters. We had attack helicopters with Gatling guns and rockets. They were gunships that were supporting us that belonged to us. I talked to them. I brought those attack helicopters in. I got them firing on the Somalis, and that incredible amount of firepower was able to kind of give us some breathing space to establish ourselves around the crash site. And so that was my job, and that's what I was able to do within the first 30 or so minutes of the fight.
One of the things that's fascinating, as I read in your book, you talked about every time that you talk with another participant in the battle, you learn something new. I think it's because you had like you knew what was happening directly around you and could witness that. They had a different point of view and new things. So over the course of what we got to 30 years things, you've obviously learned a lot more about it since then than what you probably actually knew in the middle of the conflict. Is that a fair statement?
Oh, 100%, 100%. You in a fight like, especially a fight like that, an urban fight, your scope of vision literally and figuratively comes down to about 10 feet. And that's your frame of understanding. Beyond that, you cannot be sure what's going on. It's literally like a tunnel vision, both in your vision and what you're seeing and experiencing and what you're understanding. So everything beyond that becomes a little hazy. There's even, and your memory plays tricks with you as well, in a situation like that. I talk about this in the book, but in intense combat like that, you're often reacting and then cognitively understanding what you're doing a couple seconds later. So you're kind of behind on the tape. I was doing things before I was even thinking about it. And my mind was thinking I was seeing a situation, but my training, I rose to the level of my training, and my training kicked in, and I was reacting before my mind was completely understanding what I was seeing, Somali enemy in front of me, or different civilians assisting the Somalis, different situations like that. So again, you can only be sure of what you're seeing directly in front of you. And again, your memory plays tricks on you. But one of the great benefits of both being a history professor at Liberty and the amount of time that's gone by is I was able to kind of use some of those historian skills and go back and analyze what I thought were the facts, establish facts, and then dig into perceptions, and then do a bunch of interviews and a bunch of research to establish what actually was fact and was just misconception or misperception. And there was a number of those. And so there's some things in the book that a lot of people, that no one really knows. I think is the first time it's been in print, the sequence of events and why some of those things happen, and some of the experiences I learned from some of my comrades in Task Force Ranger.
Did you and your team know, at what point did you know that you were going to have to make it through the night, or that what was your expectation of the UN forces and the timing of it? Obviously, they weren't coming immediately, but when did you know that you had to make it through that, or was it uncertain when they were going to arrive?
Initially, it was kind of a step-by-step process, but again, we expected, the plan on paper. And, a battle never really conforms to the plan on paper, but the plan on paper that was within 30 minutes, we would receive reinforcements. We were skeptical of that. And about 30 minutes into the battle, we knew that wasn't going to happen. We had very good communications within our group, within the task force. And so the word was passed that the initial quick reaction had failed in their attempt to reach us and turn back. And so from that point on, we were relying principally on the guys to our left, the Rangers and special operators to our left and our right, and in our case, the gunships that were overhead. And so that's when you really have to dig down and rely on your unit cohesion. And Task Force Ranger had extremely high unit cohesion. And what I mean by that is you're dealing with a fight in front of you, and there's a fight going on to your left and your right, but you got to rely that those guys there are going to take care of that, and that they're not going to run and they're not going to step back. And it absolutely, emboldens you that you're not going to step back because they're relying on you as well. And our huge advantage that we had was that we had our special operations aviation pilots above us that we knew were not going to leave us no matter what happened. And that was the case throughout the night. As we held our ground, Those helicopters never left us. But we knew the ultimate resolution of getting out of there was going to be dependent on the UN. And so we were getting updates that they were putting something together. They were going to try to get out there, but we just had no idea when it was going to be. But we just had to focus on the fact that we would not and could not take a step back.
When did you realize, and in the interviews or the discussions with others, that there were Al Qaeda forces that were involved in advisors for the Somalis?
Yeah, we actually had a very good, the special operations element that I was with obviously has some of the best intelligence, even to this day, especially to this day, around. And so we knew that Al Qaeda, we knew there was a character named Osama bin Laden up in the Sudan. At that time, he was in the Sudan. He'd come from Afghanistan to the Sudan with his organization, Al Qaeda. That's where they were headquartered. He later left there and went back to Afghanistan in the 9/11 era. But at that time, he was in Sudan. We knew they had training camps there. We were told in our intelligence reports that General Adid and the Somalis were sending fighters up there to be trained. In fact, a group of 400 or so had just come back and were involved in the fight. And we knew they were in the city and were going to try to get involved in a fight. And they, in fact, did that day. So we had very good understanding that they were there on the ground. What we didn't know was the level of capability they had, especially in being able to modify their weapon systems and shoot down Black Hawk helicopters. Our assessment, which proved incorrect, was that our helicopters couldn't get shot down. The tactics we used were going to make them impervious to ground fire, and tragically for us, that wasn't the case that day. But we did feel confident in our plan, as I mentioned, the hour-long ability to be on the ground and then get out before they could react. But we did have intelligence reports that Al Qaeda was present and advising and participating in the fight.
So there's another example of our adversaries testing us, pushing us, learning from an engagement that they had. I think, was it earlier in '93 that the first World Trade Center bombing had occurred or attempted?
Yes, they had attempted. That's right. Most people forget about that. There was an attempt to blow up the World Trade Center prior to 9/11, certainly, and then earlier that year. And to springboard off a previous question, you talk about our adversaries observing our reactions to things. One of the things that Osama bin Laden took from that fight is he knew that his forces were not going to be able to militarily stand up against U.S. forces based on the battle in Mogadishu, but he saw the end state, the political end state of that we were not willing to accept the high casualties that a hard fight, a hard battle is going to incur. He knew Al Qaeda was willing to accept those kind of casualties. And so he thought if he hit us hard, that we would shrink from the fight. And that's one of tragically, one of the perceptions that he took from Mogadishu, the battle in Mogadishu, to lead him to such a hard attack on us in 9/11.
Yeah, that's an interesting observation, and one that we see some commonality between him and Russia in regards to the value of human life. Things. What so taking, the UN forces finally arrive. You're able to get out of there. You obviously have some tremendous examples and of heroism and valor that you take out of that battle. Like, talk a little bit about that and what you saw, from your standpoint of U.S. forces.
Yeah, I actually was wounded pretty early on in the fight after I was able to get the helicopter gunships on target safely and effectively, safely for us and effectively against the enemy. Not long after that, really like seconds after that, I was pretty seriously wounded to the degree that I had to be pulled into the casualty evacuation, the room where we're bringing all the casualties. So I got to observe, my comrades fighting from that point on. And then through the radio network, because I was on the radio, and through the movement out of that area, once we did link up with the UN convoy, or once the armor got to us and we were able to load up on the armor, later the next morning, I was able to observe a lot of what's going on. And obviously, most people know about the two most notable examples: special operators Gary Gordon and Randy Shugart, who were snipers on board a helicopter orbiting above that fight. Went in on the ground when a second helicopter was shot down. Actually, the helicopter that I rode in on after we were dropped off, got shot down about a mile away. And we committed, I mentioned a very small number of forces that we had at our disposal. We committed everything we had to holding that first crash site. So when the second crash site occurred, the aircraft's call sign was Super 64. It's where Mike Durant was the pilot, again, the pilot of my helicopter. When they got shot down, there was no one left to be able to go in on that site except these two snipers, Gary Gordon and Randy Shugart. And obviously that was in no way, shape, or form intended that they be committed on the ground. But they knew, again, I mentioned the communications that we had, they knew there was no other way to try to save those guys in that second helicopter because we could see that they were alive from observation. And so they volunteered not once, but 3 times to go in on the ground, and were finally put in. And one of the things that I discovered in the book, it was not just a suicide mission. There was a plan to try to get other helicopters into the area, to try to get other helicopters on the ground. If they could just get in, get the injured guys out, and then move them to this helicopter, they could extract them. And tragically, they just weren't able to do it before the Somalis overran the site. So that's just one of the examples of heroism. But again, just I go back to every man in that task force that was out in the street was not going to take a step back because he knew that if he did, he was leaving the guy to his left and his right exposed. And so it was not only critical for them to fight for your own life, but you're fighting to protect the guys to your left and right. It was absolutely essential. And the vast majority of men that were out there just 100% committed themselves to that day. The SOCOM commander, the Special Operations Command commander, a 4-star general named Wayne Downing, and one of his speeches afterwards likened it to Iwo Jima, saying uncommon valor was a common virtue.
What a fascinating story, and what a remarkable story for our country, and the acts of heroism. So we can't, I get a little bit overwhelmed and everything, but thank you and your fellow soldiers for everything that you've done. I think
Thank you.
We're fortunate to have folks that are willing to stand the line. So you make it out there, and you've got some recovery to do, injured things, but you stay in the military. You've been an advisor in multiple engagements since then. What lessons did you take from Mogadishu to Iraq and to Afghanistan and the other places that you've been?
Well, again, one of the things that I brought out of that, and as you mentioned, I was seriously injured, so it took a couple years. But one of the great assets in the U.S. military, and especially the U.S. Army, is Walter Reed Army Medical Center up in Washington, D.C. And I can't say enough, that's really one of the things that, the military says it has the best combat trauma treatment in the world. It really does. It couldn't be any better. I had multiple teams of doctors work on rebuilding my leg and reconstructing my leg. And they did that to a degree. I was able to go back to the Ranger Regiment, back to the infantry. I've parachuted on it. I've run a marathon on it. It's really an unbelievable testament to the dedication of the medical people in the U.S. military, especially at Walter Reed Army Medical Center. And so I did return to the infantry. As I'd mentioned, 5 more wars after that. Just a number of lessons that I took from that. One, the Ranger Regiment, being a special operations force, has extremely difficult and rigorous training. And we try to do all of our training as close as possible to combat. And that unfortunately incurs losses. We lose guys killed and injured in combat, in training. But that completely validated itself in Mogadishu. I wouldn't say that level and intensity of combat was almost a natural environment for us, but it really was, because that's how we trained, constantly using live fire, constantly pushing the envelope as much as we could, and extreme amounts of teamwork. And I will say that there was some bumps in the road. There always will be as you're forming a special operations task force. But SOCOM, Special Operations Command, took the lessons of what went well on the ground in Mogadishu and what didn't go so well, as far as intelligence, as far as all the different components working together closely, as far as having backup plans, not just relying on a paper plan that I referred to, but absolutely rock solid backup plans, and bringing enough assets to the fight for even an extreme situation that's not anticipated. And so all those things were learned and retooled. And when 9/11 occurred, about almost 10 years later, Special Operations Command was very well postured to immediately begin operations in Afghanistan extremely effectively. And I took many of the same lessons learned on that. I did not rely after that on just paper plans. A whole nother chapter, maybe a whole nother book someday, but we were able to win the Battle of Ramadi in Iraq in 2006, based on the fact that we were handed a paper plan and it was just not feasible. And we knew it wasn't. So we went and went on a different course and were able to win that battle in 2006 and 2007 against Al-Qaeda in Ramadi. So that's just one of the examples is, you're going to obey orders. You're going to do the best you can, but you're not just going to rely on a paper statement that some capability is going to be there then when you know it's not. And you're going to work around that and make things happen for victory.
Yeah. A fascinating story, I think. So the book is With My Shield, an Army Ranger in Somalia. I think so, make sure I get it, James Lechner. Thank you, Jim, for spending some time with us today, chatting about your experiences and for writing the book. I know folks will enjoy the read and come away with a greater sense of patriotism and valor and appreciation for our military and the role that they have in protecting freedom, both here at home as well as around the world. So I thank you. We're gonna post the link to the book. You can buy it on Amazon. We'll post that link in the comments. Jim, before we leave, any parting words of advice that you would want to give for folks tuning in today?
Well, I really appreciate the opportunity. I've really enjoyed being here with you. Yeah, the book is important to me, but I think it's an important story for our soldiers and for our society to remember. 30 years has gone by, and in spite of hit movies and best-selling other books, Black Hawk Down, there are still people that don't know the story, and I really, that's the reason I wrote it, not just as a catharsis, but to tell their story and to make sure the facts are out there and to recognize the valor of those guys, and also to validate in this, not to get too political, but to validate in this woke society, there's a reason that we did things back then that the U.S. military is not doing now, and it really it scares me, our future, when we're fighting against adversaries that are not woke and are not undercutting the basic tenets of military training and military capability. So I really appreciate this. It's on Amazon, it's on Barnes and Noble, it's published by Osprey, and I really appreciate the opportunity to share the story.
Great. And I know too, just as an observation, things that, with your degree in history and then having been a firsthand witness to this and been a participant of it, things we probably have one of the best accounts of the incident here for folks to read. Things With My Shield, an Army Ranger in Somalia, but with Jim Lechner. But thank you so much for your time and for joining us here on GovExperts Insights. We will look forward to keeping in touch with you.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much.
Thanks for joining this edition of GovExperts Insights. We invite you to follow this and other episodes at govexperts.com or on LinkedIn, Facebook, YouTube, and our other social media channels.